Our ancient witness this morning is from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 10 through 13. What do workers gain from their toil? I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. God has made everything beautiful in its time. God has also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for people than to be happy and do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their toil. This is the gift of God.
This being Labor Day weekend, it just seemed fitting, of course, that, and I think it's been done quite frequently in this church, you kind of focus on that topic of labor and what it means. And so I spent a bit of time kind of mulling over what scripture might speak to this fundamental thing we do called work or labor or toil, whatever we want to call it. And really, there's not a whole lot. You would think in the Bible there'd be a lot to say about labor itself or work. There's a lot about economic justice and so forth, but work itself as a kind of a sacrament of sorts is very, it's not a lot. But I did find this passage in Ecclesiastes that I appreciate very much. As we know, much of the word from Ecclesiastes have a rather dour and pessimistic tone to them, but much of the work of words of this book are maybe captured in the song from the 70s band. I think they're still around, maybe playing Fairgrounds, Kansas. Dust in the wind, right? You like that? All we are is dust in the wind. That's Ecclesiastes right there. But there are a few wonderful insights, bright spots in this book, and what we just read, I think, is one of them. The writer asks a very relevant question. What do workers get from their toil? What do we get? What do we get from, maybe we don't use the word toil, maybe a more neutral word. What do we get from our labor, our work? It's a worthy question to ponder. As I thought, ideally we want to get it, I would say, and just to answer, a sense of satisfaction would be nice, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of appreciation and respect, certainly a means for paying our bills and having money perhaps to spare, what we might call a livable wage, a job that gives to the world more than it takes, a job that improves, we might say, metaphorically speaking at least, and literally improves the soil rather than depletes it, or carefully harvests our trees rather than clear cut, or manufacture products and things that meet real human needs. I think specifically education and health would be right there, and fundamental needs, and food and shelter, and art and beauty, rather than creating more plastic things and weapons of war. Don't we all want work that at some level, I think the human being wants work that feeds their soul on some level, that serves more than it exploits? And sadly, we know that this is not the case for much of our work and force and labor in our world. Much of the work done by people in this country and around the world is lower paid sweat labor and service work. This low-paid work, as we know, has unpredictable hours, less than full-time, less than livable wage, and often no benefits, and all this translates, in many respects, when you boil it down, to a lack of respect for the person providing that work. Work that exploits the marginalized and the vulnerable is sadly a problem, and that is spoken of quite a bit in the biblical witness. Those at the bottom, those who, for whatever reason, be they by circumstance of birth or lack of temperament or systemic oppression, whatever it is, people struggle at the bottom, and that is a concern, ought to be a fundamental concern for us as people of faith. As I read the statistics in the US, these are just numbers, but they're relevant. We have 38 million Americans living at the poverty level, which is defined, as I understand, as 4 people living on $30,000 a year, which we know that's crazy. You can't do that. We have around 7 million folks who work and would be classified as the working poor. There should be zero, no working poor in our society, but we have 7 million, according to the statistics I looked at. In 1954, there were 35% of the workers who were unionized. Today, it's less than 10%. The average rent overall in the US, and of course, as a realtor, Gary, you'd understand it's all, of course, variations depending on where you live. But what I read is around $1,300 on average for a 900 square foot house. I don't know how that, again, widely varies, but average operational expense of a US household is $63,000, and that's for a household of 2. 600,000 Americans are homeless. Worldwide, we had 2.4 billion people facing a lack of consistent access to food. Around 900 million individuals face severe food insecurity. 100 million people are forcibly displaced in our world, many of them coming out of Ukraine, Syria, or Afghanistan, but many other places, of course, as well. As Christian people living by biblical values, we need to be champions of work. We need to fight for and live, and this means how we consume, as if everyone is entitled to provision for basic human needs. We shouldn't have this great tension between our needs to survive by earning a living and engaging with the world in what we might call meaningful work. We shouldn't have to work to survive. There's plenty in the world for everyone if we share. As one of the earlier sermons I preached at the church on the loaves and the fishes story, that of any story in all the Gospels is the most told. It's told 6 different times in 4 Gospels. And it's a story of provision, right? This is how the world is, this is how God has designed the world, that provide for everyone with plenty left over. The metaphor of the Bible is the great banquet feast, really, where we are invited, all are invited to partake. Jesus' question is, what good is it to gain the whole world and still lose one's soul? It's at the center of loving our neighbor as ourselves. 1 John asks, how does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses help? Biblically speaking, we cannot really talk fully about the subject of work and labor without also asking about the tension between poverty and wealth. As for the wealth we are called toward, the biblical witness starts right out at the very beginning, and it's on the front of your bulletin. Genesis 2:15. God placed the human, I didn't weed out the the man. Adam is human. God placed the human in the garden to tend and to keep it. It's a metaphor. In a nutshell, that's our human vocation, living into the original call of where true wealth lies. To tend and care for the garden is the metaphor for tending and caring for the earth and the created order. We should understand that all human work is sacred, and it's stewardship work, care work, or as our native brothers and sisters have taught us, work that considers the welfare of the next 7 generations. Sacred labor is not about money, but about long-term sustainability and love of neighbor. That's really the only work that God calls us to. So under the model of work, whether one is the most menial of laborers or most powerful of employers, the calling is the same. If you are a owner or a capitalist or the owner of production, your work is as sacred as the one who does the work. The product must be sustainable and good for the welfare of the whole. And if you are the boss or the employer, not only does the product need to be for the nurture and long-term good of creation, the workers under hire must be fairly provided for with compensation that allows for the fulfillment of their needs as human beings. In other words, a livable wage. I don't know where it's at right now, but I believe it was somewhere around $30 an hour to really have a 40-hour-a-week livable wage job. Economic fairness and thriving has clearly not been the situation with the human race for a long time. We consider the story of Exodus. It's a story of struggle for the exploited and the enslaved people to free themselves as God would have it. And then once establishing freedom and entering into the promised land and becoming their own nation, the once enslaved needed some divine instruction for not turning around and doing the same to others. In Deuteronomy 24:14, it says, "Do not take advantage of a hired person who is poor and needy, regardless of whether that person is an Israelite or a foreigner living among you." Or Leviticus, it says, "When a foreigner resides with you in your land, you must not oppress him. You must treat the foreigner living among you as native born and love him as yourself, for you are foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." There were also recognized in the Bible the dangers of wealth disparity. And to that, one of my favorite proverbs is Proverbs 37-9. And it says, "Two things I ask of you, God. Do not refuse them before I die. Keep falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise, I may have too much and disown you and say, 'Who is God?' Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of my God." And that's what happens when we have this disparity, great disparity oftentimes between such rich and such poor. The rich forget who God is, and the poor are forced to, shall we say, corrupt means to survive. Clearly, we human beings have a propensity to stray far from the original mandate to care for the garden. We see this currently in our latest iteration of extreme global wealth disparity, where we see the world's 1% owning 50% of the world's total wealth. That's crazy, right? But it's true, apparently. Or another way of looking at it is 26 of the world's richest people own as much as the world's poorest 50%. Again, that disparity that Proverbs speaks of seems to be true. Looking at the Proverbs text, it tells us two things. When we have too much wealth, we have a tendency, as I say, to forget God, lose our sense of our true nature and calling as created beings, to tend and to care for the garden. We're too focused on building our empires and protecting our market shares. And if we have too little, we may be tempted or maybe even forced to survive by stealing and thus dishonor the name of God, and put stealing in quotes. When I think of the last part, being compelled to steal, I have to ask the question through the lens of macroeconomics, the larger economic systems. What systemic economic and political forces came into play that led down the path to stealing? Is it not the poverty and the marginalization that leads to, say, addiction, that leads to stealing? And then the question is, so who is the sinner here? Who is the one responsible for dishonoring God? Are not all culpable? Are we not all our brother's keeper? And while it is very true that the vast majority do labor in tedious and unjustly compensated work, still in many cases, these, I'll call them worker saints, manage to do their work with grace and joy and a sense of service. Think of nurses' aides in care centers. Think of people who work in the fields. Think of the maids who clean our hotel rooms. Think of the call center workers who get rejected and despised hundreds of times a day. Just such are the ones we celebrate today. And I know celebrating call workers who get on our nerves is not easy, but it is a hard job, right? Those who labor under difficult situations are the ones we must never cease to champion and ask of ourselves, how am I, by the way I consume, and the way I acknowledge the situation, how am I contributing to or uplifting said people in their work situation? The one little example is, and this may ruin your diet for tuna, but you know, when you buy tuna from Thailand on the label, there could be a good chance that was fished under slave labor conditions. Tuna fishing boats are noted for contracting with Burmese fishermen or call them fishermen workers who aren't let off the boat for years and abused terribly. So we need to look where our products are made and how they're made that we consume. When it comes to the issue of economics and labor, it's amazing how little attention the church has given to the central message of the biblical prophets, whose main point is centered on the issue of social justice and as it relates to true worship. Isaiah 58, this is in nice King James English here. Is not this the fast that I have chosen? To loose the bands of wickedness and undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free, yet ye break every yoke. Is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry, that thou bring the poor that are cast out of thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh? Then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and thine health shall spring forth speedily, and thy righteousness shall go before thee. The glory of the Lord shall be thy reward. Then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer. Thou shalt cry, and God shall say, Here I am. And if thou take away from the midst of thee the yoke, the putting forth of the finger, and speaking vainly, and if thou draw out thy soul to the hungry, and satisfy the afflicted soul, then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness shall be as noonday. And while the prophets remind us of how far astray we people, especially we religious people, tend to go, I return our attention back to the words and vision from the text of Ecclesiastes. Were we to fully take into our hearts and minds these words, God has set eternity in the human heart, my heart, your heart, the worker's heart who made the very bread we are to eat in our communion, which symbolically we call Christ's body broken for us. Yet, the writer says, no one can fathom what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know there is nothing better for people than to be happy and to do good while they live, that each of them may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all their labor. This is the gift of God. Well, many of us have known hard work. Many of us, not all of us, also have had the privilege of doing work that paid well and gave some sense of satisfaction. For this we are blessed, and we have also been allowed to pass that blessing on to our children through generational wealth. But for many, that is not the case, and we know it, and it is for them that we are obligated to consider, to pray for, and most importantly, act on behalf of. As the prophet reminds us, for then shall thy light shine as the morning, and thy health break forth speedily. May it be so.